Apologies to those of you who want to review. I'm not going to review Censor. I want to talk about the film, but I want to talk about the film as it relates to modern fandom inside the horror community and how we see a growing divide among the fans. So, I can't find a way to not say this in a way that's going to sound at least a little bit demeaning to part of the fan base, and I don't mean it that way. But there's not a way to go about this that's not going to hurt someone's feelings. In the last 8-9 years, there's been a rise of what some people call elevated horror. And these are films like the A24 films, like Hammer's The Lodge. And these are films that are designed for adults. They're horror films, but they're meant to affect you on an intellectual and advanced emotional level. They're meant really to make you feel things you haven't felt before, rather than to try and recapture moods that are comfortable, even if they're scary or uncomfortable. The easiest way to look at this is something like Hereditary. Hereditary is not a film designed for children. It's not really the violence on screen that makes it not appropriate for children. It's that the family dynamics and the awkward structure of telling a story basically about a family that's falling apart is really at the heart of it. And that's not going to appeal to your average 14, 15-year-old. And horror has a long tradition, going back to the old monster movie days that, still own my heart, of being kind of designed for adolescents. And there's nothing wrong with, as an adult, still loving those films, including new films. It doesn't have to just be about nostalgia. In fact, I would hope that you could really tap into your younger self through these films. I think that's a really, really healthy thing. But I can't survive on a diet of just that. I need films that do the next thing, go the next place. And this isn't a new concept at all. I'd say The Exorcist is a great example of a film that really strove to be much more than the traditional monster movie for adolescents would ever have allowed it to be. So we have a tradition of adult horror films. Censor came onto my radar this year when it started to get some chatter from some film festivals. And it seemed right down my alley. It's a film about my favorite subject, censorship. It's also a film about a period that I have a lot of nostalgia personally for, which is the video nasty era. Now, in America, we didn't have the same sort of censorship, but we actually kind of did. It just didn't come from the government. The entertainment industry sort of regulated itself to the same end. So you ended up in a world where we were still getting, Dario Argento films edited down to what today would be a PG-13 level. But it wasn't happening because the government was not allowing these films to be released. It was because the industry had set up this whole system that made it harder and harder to market films if it didn't have a rating. And to get a rating, you had to play ball with the MPAA. And to play ball with the MPAA, you had to really match their map of what was acceptable socially at that time. And that happened to be very, very similar to what was going on in England with the video nasties. That said, there was still a bunch of companies putting out VHS tapes of films that would have been just outright banned in most of Europe, actually. So I don't want to really equate the two. I'm just meaning to say that, to me, censorship is not about who censors as a definition. It's about what happens to the work itself. If the work itself gets watered down, that is censorship. The reasoning behind it might be completely different. In America, it's a profit motive. In Europe and in England in particular, it was often a government censor who was deciding what was acceptable and not. So a horror film based around that time period is a no-brainer for me. It's really an easy film to sell to me. On top of it, it seemed to have that allure of the deeply psychological, which is the A24 model. It's a matter of taking extraordinary events, though not necessarily supernatural, though they could be, and putting them through a prism of a very adult, sophisticated psychology. And Censor, kind of even in the trailers, was making it known that it's a film about a woman who cannot remember a traumatic event from the past, whose job is now to edit films so they don't offend people. And so it's obvious, like, she doesn't remember what offends her, and she's searching for that thing. At the same time, she's affecting people's memory of movies, or how they perceive or how they're allowed to experience these movies. So that's a really cool concept. It has a lot of synergy behind it. It's a smart literary concept, although I don't see how you could tell this story on the page very well. It's a literary concept that's really designed for the screen, which in itself is really interesting. Also, the aesthetic is really cool. At times, it looks like a really rich but small budgeted film, much like what A24 or Hammer have recently started doing. But at other times, it does fully embrace the 80s VHS aesthetic, and not just by having glitches on screen. There's even framing that is very evocative of some classic 80s exploitation titles. So that is a really cool thing for me too. But a film like this has an uphill battle with part of fandom, because it's not going to explain itself fully. It's not going to give you a roadmap. You're going to experience the films. You'll probably come out where most people will come out on it. I don't think it's really... it's not like a David Lynch film, whereas you're going to get 17 different, interpretations of the content of the film. It's not that at all. But what it is a sensory experience that's based in emotions. And I think that always lends itself to having a certain part of the audience just turn off, become disinterested, not be willing to put in the work that a film like this demands of you. I don't think it's a deep movie, per se. It just has more going on than the typical Hollywood production at the time, which might be a low hurdle to cross. But I would say the appeal of this film is the time period it's set at, the psychology of the character, the look of the film, and the attention to the detail that shows that this wasn't a 2-month research of the horror genre. This is clearly coming from a place of deep, deep, deep appreciation of the genre and the genre's history. Now, a film like this is also wonderful because it is absolutely a political horror film, but it doesn't take the kind of sides that you'd expect. It's not pro-censorship, definitely, but it's strangely not completely anti-censorship either. And I think that's an interesting exploration. It's not that the film is ever suggesting that films should be cut, as much as it's exploring the emotional need for people to have that kind of power to sand down edges that would disturb them. And what is that impulse about? That's what the movie is exploring. It's exploring the psychology of the censor, as well as to give the viewer a chance to kind of subvert their own expectations and alliances. Because there's moments in this film where you start to really, really not side with the exploitation filmmaker, a producer in particular. The film very smartly doesn't make him a misunderstood genius. Instead, that producer's pretty much the slime bag you'd expect him to be. And by doing that, you make it a more complex picture. I think that movies like this are important for the genre, because it's going to divide the genre, but it's going to provide a lot of conversation. And those conversations will work as the conversations they are, but they'll also work as the conversation about a time period that really has informed the last 40 years of cinema. The horror genre usually does not get the credit it deserves for tackling tough issues. And yet, if you look at the history of the horror film, there's been so many cases where this type of movie has been able to explore themes and ideas that no other genre really has the vocabulary to do. So I'm going to suggest that everyone out there go out there and watch Censor. It is streaming right now. You're going to have to pay for it. I don't think it's on any free services at this point. But I think it's well worth your money and your time. It's a shorter film. It's not going to eat up your whole day like some of the more luxurious Hollywood productions of recent. You'll get out of Censor what you put into it. The first act does move at a slower pace. I found the subject matter fascinating, but you might be impatient. All I'll say is have some patience with it because it's worth it. And by the time you get to the third act does some, I think, really, really cool and subtly revolutionary things. Not that you're going to see it and say, I've never seen anything done like this, but the context and the construction of that third act is really, really very cool and very forward-thinking for the genre. So, anyway, my suggestion, this is not a review. A proper review would go into the story at depth, and we'd talk about the performances and the music, and all that's very, very good. It's not a perfect movie. If you want my Schoolhouse grade, I give it an A-. But an A-, frankly, in modern film, gets my blood pressure up to where I want it to be and really does excite me. So I would definitely suggest Censor, and I'd love to hear what you think. Leave some comments down below. Reach out to me on one of our community streams to let us know what you think. We would love to have a conversation around this film. Thanks, guys. See ya.